Does anybody else feel like there's something not quite right about Resident Evil 0? It looks like a normal Resident Evil game, it sounds like a normal Resident Evil game, and yet when you get your hands on it, it doesn't quite feel like a normal Resident Evil game. In my view, that's primarily down to two changes in particular: the introduction of the partner mechanic and the removal of item boxes, both of which shook up the Resident Evil formula, but not altogether successfully. They're not necessarily bad changes, but they both fail to make a positive impression due to the lack of attention paid to how the rest of Resident Evil 0 is designed around them. So where best to begin looking at things more closely? Well, let's start with a very speedy explanation of what this pair of relatively major changes actually encompasses. The partner mechanic does exactly what it says on the tin. Instead of players being able to take control of one character, as was usual for Resident Evil at the time, in 0 they can switch between two, STARS rookie Rebecca Chambers and possible war criminal Billy Cohen, with only a press of a button needed to move between them. Both members of this dynamic duo have their own inventory with 6 slots, and each has his or her own strengths and weaknesses. Billy has more health, can deal more damage, has a higher chance of hitting headshots, can fire the Magnum faster, is able to push objects, can play the piano, and has no weaknesses whatsoever. And Rebecca can combine herbs and chemicals and die far quicker. When not in control of a character, players can choose whether they attack enemies on sight or remain idle, they can tell them to wait or follow them as necessary, and they can even swap items with them using a dual inventory setup. There is also the option to manually move the non-player character if the AI is being a tad disagreeable. In Resident Evil 0's defense, it doesn't happen that often, but it can be a little ridiculous when it does. Fuck off. Fuck off. Please fuck off. Oh, and if either of the pair kicks the bucket, it's game over. The removal of item boxes is far more straightforward. In every other mainline old-school Resident Evil title, players could store any items they picked up during their travels in item boxes scattered throughout the game in question. Aside from when playing at higher difficulties in certain titles, the contents of these boxes would remain consistent, which meant players never had to worry about leaving any of their hard-earned knickknacks behind. An item stored in a box at the start of the game would still be accessible using a box near the end of the game, and vice versa. And in what was a first for a mainline Resident Evil title, they were entirely absent in 0. Now, as I mentioned during the introduction, these changes by no means condemn the game to mediocrity. In fact, I can envisage a world where they could have made Resident Evil 0 a standout experience. Different enough from other games in the series that it felt like a bold twist on the established formula, but similar enough that it avoided alienating fans of the series who weren't exactly clamouring for something new and exciting. And hey, some may even argue that they managed to do just that. But I wouldn't. In fact, I'd even go so far as to say that not only did these changes not land well at all, but a flurry of other poor design choices made by Capcom throughout the game make 0's issues seem even worse than they would have been otherwise. But before I take a look at some specific examples of why that's the case, let's first delve a little deeper into how these two changes fail to improve the core Resident Evil experience. There are 4 words which I think sum up why rather nicely: time spent managing items. As is to be expected in any old-school Resident Evil title, players will collect a rather large amount of items during their time with 0, encompassing everything from weapons and ammo to healing items and various keys, statuettes and leech charms that are needed in order to progress. In every game other than 0, players would most likely pick up most of what they came across and then head to the nearest item box to squirrel away anything they didn't require at that exact moment, which meant picking up a key in one area which needed to be used in another, or a healing item which was surplus to requirements was no problem whatsoever. They could pop them in an item box for safekeeping and then take them out again as and when they were needed at another. This system not only made maintaining a clutter-free inventory a breeze, but it also meant viewing what items were available and then actually moving them back and forward between boxes in their inventory was as smooth as butter. But Resident Evil 0 does things a little differently. Where players would once store anything they found in item boxes, in 0 they can simply drop items on the floor. Yes, rather than being able to store items in various boxes scattered across locations ready to be used at the drop of a hat, players can now litter to their heart's content, leaving items wherever they please. Upon first hearing this, you might think that that doesn't sound so bad either. In fact, you may even think it sounds like a good thing, offering players a level of flexibility they didn't previously have. There are 2 problems with this argument. Firstly, dropping one item to pick up another seemingly more useful item doesn't actually solve a problem. Like any other Resident Evil game, players will most likely head back to an area to collect anything they didn't pick up the first time or anything they were forced to drop. So no time is actually being saved by implementing this system, nor is it making 0 any more fun to actually play. Second, once players have picked up everything in an area, they are then no longer able to properly store items, organise them, or quickly move them in and out of their inventories. What most players will likely end up doing is creating a room-sized item box, storing everything they need on the floor of one central location they can return to at any time to grab whatever they need, but with the added bonus of everything taking longer to do and being more fiddly to execute. The usual process of entering an item box, maybe depositing a few bits and bobs and taking out a previously stored item required to progress is lovely and quick, and is done through one menu. In 0, players have to head back to their item room, go to their inventory and drop anything not needed, find the items on the floor they do need to pick up, and then pick them up one at a time. And if they change their mind at any point, they have to go through some of that process again, which can also be somewhat annoying, as even when you think you've positioned a character perfectly in front of the item you need, they can sometimes develop a temporary blindness to the large gun or healing item at their feet and stand there doing nothing. Dropping items solves no problems and actually adds a constant layer of frustration, because you feel like you're doing something you could already do much more fluidly in other Resident Evil games. There was 0 reasons to change anything. What I haven't talked about too much yet is the partner system. Maybe that helps alleviate some of the issues with item storage and management. I mean, surely having those 2 6-slot inventories means there's more than enough space to collect everything lying around, with plenty of room to spare for weapons and ammo as well. Well, no. For starters, most players will feel that both characters need at minimum a handgun and ammo. After all, those zombies aren't going to kill themselves. And given that once the opening train section completes, it doesn't take long for some fairly nasty creatures to begin turning up, including the terrible Leechmen, which I'll come back to shortly. They'll probably also want at least one character to be carrying a weapon with a little more firepower, say a shotgun. One character will have 4 spaces remaining after adding a handgun and ammo, while for some extraordinarily harebrained reason, any larger weapons take up 2 slots, meaning the other character will only have 3 remaining after adding a heavy weapon and its corresponding ammunition. Oh, and you'll most likely want to bring along a healing item as well, so that's another slot filled. 12 slots across 2 characters sounds like a lot, but it's a lot less than you'd think once you take all of that into account. What this means is that on top of the increased time spent on inventory management in whichever central area players choose to store their items, they now have to spend more time fiddling about with 2 characters' inventories as well. The lack of space means they'll spend much more time than usual in their inventory screen while exploring, desperately trying to decide whether the shotgun shells or the black wing are more important. And on top of that, maybe they need to swap an item between characters or rearrange things so that 2 items are in either Rebecca or Billy's inventory and can then be combined. It all adds to the time spent not doing the fun parts of the game. Long story short, between the partner mechanic and the lack of item boxes, players are going to be spending a lot more time than they'd like managing their inventory. The old school Resident Evil experience fans know and love is still in there, but there are so many interruptions caused by the way these 2 changes interact with each other, which frankly didn't have to happen, that I think many will struggle with the way they break up gameplay. Okay, so hopefully everything I've spoken about so far has given you a better idea of why 0's needless tweaking of mechanics wasn't a particularly great idea, but even with those poorly thought out changes in place, there was still a chance for at least some redemption. If 0 was designed to at least work around them well and use them to their fullest, perhaps that would serve to add something of a silver lining. The problem is, 0 kind of drops the ball there too. That's not to say there aren't some considerations made to help players or to make the game feel like a different experience from the usual. Once the train section is completed, all items left on it will be dumped outside so players can still easily access them, and the map screen features an easily understood log of where any items players have dropped or discovered by attempting to pick them up can be found. Unfortunately, however, there's a lot more design choices that I simply do not understand the logic behind, as I cannot see how the developers thought they would improve the game. They're all rather self-explanatory, so I'm going to run through the ones that annoy me most in fairly quick-fire fashion to help give you a better sense of why 0 is such a strangely designed game. First off, the Leechmen. Not only are they bullet sponges, which can only really be defeated by carrying around Molotov cocktails, which means using another inventory slot, but they also explode upon death when killed with anything other than fire. I understand it creates a risk-reward scenario and forces players to choose between risking losing more health and using up valuable Molotovs or flame rounds, but an enemy which unleashes an area of effect attack, combined with an AI partner who usually isn't overly keen to move away from the exploding monstrosity in question, is not the best idea. Speaking of annoying enemies, how about the boss encounters using only one character? It's not such an issue during the fight with the Scorpion on the train at the start of the game, but my goodness does it become an issue later on. The Centipede is bad enough, forcing players to take control of a possibly under-equipped Billy, but it then does it again not long after during the fight against the giant bat. If you get to either of these points and your character doesn't have what they need to succeed, then tough luck. Oh, and the bat in particular is absolutely terrible if players do find themselves in this position. It is incredibly difficult to actually hit, especially with the smaller, arguably even more irritating bats backing the big boy up. They're not as egregious as the infamous Code Veronica Tyrant encounter, which forced a fair few players into restarting their game entirely, and is one I still consider a staggering example of developer incompetence, but they're not great at all. This problem also extends to some of the sequences where players are required to split characters up. After not playing the game for many years and completely forgetting what was about to happen, I took Rebecca into this maze with only a handgun due to the inventory constraints, and was promptly stun-locked to death by hunters who relentlessly hit me in the knees. What fun. This puzzle, which requires players split Rebecca and Billy up in order to combine chemicals, is also completely and utterly stupid. They can choose which one of the two they send to the second floor of the area and which stays behind, but it can lead to a fairly large bit of backtracking should they not choose wisely, which is impossible given 0 gives them no warning of this whatsoever. If they send Billy up to the second floor using the god-awful hookshot, then Rebecca won't be able to gather one of the two chemicals required to progress in the immediate area, and will then be forced to travel back to a previous location in order to get her hands on it, all the while also being attacked by angry monkeys, which much like the hunters have a weird obsession with going for players' knees. But if they send Rebecca up, then no problem at all, both chemicals are immediately available. Why Capcom would punish players here depending on what choice they make is honestly beyond me. Oh, and speaking of the hookshot, it is a terrible addition because of the 2 slots needed to carry it, and the fact it's required to progress multiple times throughout the game. If you've left it somewhere a long way from where it's needed, there's not a whole lot you can do to fix the problem. Not only will you have to find 2 slots in your inventory to house it, you'll also have a lot of running to do to go and get it, before then having to also return to where it's required. Which perhaps brings us to the worst problem of all, Resident Evil 0's backtracking. Players will be doing a hell of a lot of backtracking during this game. Whether it's going to grab the hookshot, moving items from one hub area to the next, or dealing with the aforementioned stupid chemical puzzle, the amount of times the game's design will force players to retrace their steps is frankly absolutely absurd. Granted, it happens in other Resident Evil titles as well, but the fact it's often caused by the way the partner system and the removal of item boxes combine, in my view, makes it unforgivable. To conclude, Resident Evil 0 is such a disappointing title because it can at times still be an entertaining experience. When out exploring new areas, worrying about what might be lurking around each corner, it can be fantastic, and there is the occasional puzzle which uses the partner system well, but the bad parts of the game are so bad, and honestly so completely unnecessary, that they really make the game as a whole feel like one that would have been better off sticking to the fundamentals, having players take control of just one character who can still take advantage of item boxes while exploring the game's spooky locations. Resident Evil's amazing remake proved that the series' core mechanics could still work fantastically well, even with a few new twists like the Crimson Heads thrown in, but Resident Evil 0 proves that if changes to the formula aren't handled with great care, everything can easily become a bit of a mess. Cheers for watching, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, do consider subscribing, leaving a comment, hitting like, etc, as it really helps the channel, and hopefully I'll see you all again soon.